Hello friends, welcome back to my channel where today I'm doing part 2 of shadows that get no or very little use within my collection. Again, this was a video suggestion by one of my subscribers, Auntie D. Raimi. Thank you very much for your idea. I think it's a very clever idea. And I will link part 1 below in the description box. I had about 12 palettes and I didn't want to make a super long video. So this is part 2. If you'd like to see it, stick around. If you're new here, hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a homeschooling stay-at-home mom. I love to play with colorful eyeshadow. I did film this look. I will link it in the description box when it's live. And I upload about 3 videos a week, all eyeshadow related content. So if you like what you see, I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing. All right, part 2. Let's dive right in. I am just having a lot of fun talking about these eyeshadow palettes. I really enjoy these theme videos because it challenges me to look at my collection through a new lens. Like, what palettes get use? What palettes are fall themed? What palettes are cool tone? It's a lot of fun, you know? It's a lot of fun. So I'm going to talk first about a BH Cosmetics palette. This is Orange Sorbet from their Sweet Shop series. I love this palette. I love this palette. I think it's so beautiful. I love the orange eyeshadow. I love the pop of vibrance and just an unexpected color you don't usually see on people's eyes. Love it. But there is one shade in here which gets very little use. Now I will say, Auntie D. Raimi's suggestion was shadows that get no use, but there were like 2 palettes in my collection where I could find shadows that I just never use. And so I thought, well, how about I broaden the parameters a little bit by saying shadows that rarely get used. So within this palette, there's one shadow which gets very little use, and that is this one over here. It's called Chocolate Drizzle. I just don't think this shadow is very exciting. I understand it's an orange monochromatic palette, so they wanted to bring in a brown, but it had to be an orangey brown. I get that. But when I want to use a brown in an orangey look, I just get a brown from somewhere else, and a brown that is more of a true brown, because this doesn't bring a lot of depth to a look that I could create with the rest of these shadows, and it doesn't bring a lot of interest either. It's just kind of a boring block kind of shade. I understand why it's here, but I personally don't get any use from that shade. There are other shadows I prefer to use when I'm working with these colors. Now let's talk about the Through My Eyes palette between ColourPop and I Love Sarahi. I do really like this palette. I think it's quite interesting and I have a lot of fun when I play with it. There are like 2 shades in here that don't really get much use. I find that I use this yellow more than I expected to because I think it's a neat contrast between the pinky, bronzy, purpley, teal tones. But this shade up here called Sandalwood and this shade right here called In a Wink are both very neutral, very close to my skin tone. I don't think I've ever used them together. I may have, but I don't think I have. If I use them, it's like this one even is the darker of the 2, and it's still too light to be a transition color from my skin tone. It just disappears. So I might use it against another color to buff it out and make that a transition tone, but I can't really use either of these as a standalone shade that brings anything to the look. So really I use them almost interchangeably, and I would use one or the other, but probably never both, to just buff out the edges of a shadow. So those are probably the least used shades within this palette. And this one right here called Canela, I don't think I've ever used this one. I really don't think I've ever used it. So maybe this would be one that just never got used. And I'm not sure why. I guess when I look at the other options in here, it just doesn't excite me as much as the others do. It's kind of a brown. Yeah, it's like a warm toned brown matte with some glitter in it. It's a pretty tone. Maybe I should use it. It's very terracotta-y. I don't know. I guess I've never used that shade. Here I am saying there are no palettes with shades I haven't touched, and Canela, I believe, is one such shade. Okay, let's talk about a staple in my collection, a palette that I have mentioned several times in recent videos because it's such a good, solid palette that just lives in my collection and brings a lot of value. Blue Moon from ColourPop. Now, if you know anything about me, you might be able to guess which shadow does not hardly ever, if ever, get used. I'll give you a minute. Which shade do you think it is? There are only 9 in here, right? And I do get a decent amount of use from this palette, but the one that I pretty much never dip into is right here. It's called Mad About You. It is a beautiful, beautiful navy shimmer. But I know I've said this 1,000 times at this point. I have blue undertones in my skin, and at this point I tend to avoid dark blue and dark purple colors, except in very limited quantities because they make me look tired. If I'm doing a blue look, I'm gonna make it a lot brighter than heavier, usually. I recently did a dark blue smoky eye, but that was kind of an anomaly for me. But anyway, Mad About You is a gorgeous navy blue shimmer, but I never touch it. I think I've used it once. Aside from that, all the other shades get a decent amount of use. This one's kind of mid-toned, but it's got a lot of silver in it, and that makes a big difference. So, I mean, it's a great palette, and that is a great shade. And if I did really want a navy blue shimmer, I would probably go into the Hummingbird palette from Uden's Eye, because that is more of a slightly more electric blue. It's got a bit more height of shine, brightness, and vibrance. Let us talk about Mimosa from BH Cosmetics. This is, again, a very nice palette. Super good quality, decent assortment of colors. It's a little too pink. I would have loved if they brought in a couple more red tones to add a bit of contrast, a bit of interest, and a bit of depth. But aside from that, I like the palette a lot. This is a nice bright white, which I do use pretty frequently. Within this palette, the shade that basically gets no use, for the same reason as the Orange Sorbet palette Chocolate Drizzle, is this one right here called Happy Hour. It's just kind of a boring brown tone. It's not very exciting, and it doesn't bring any depth to the palette, so I can't use it to deepen an outer corner. It's pretty much a mid-toned matte brown, and because there are so many mid-toned pinky colors in here, it doesn't add anything. You might be able to use it in a crease or to blend something else out, or if you wanted to do more of a neutral crease, you know, maybe these two or these three shades here, and then do pink, then that would be different, and it would bring value to that kind of a technique. But I never use the Happy Hour shade. I don't think ever. Maybe once or twice, but recently I certainly don't use it. If I want a brown, I will get a better brown from somewhere else. It's just, yeah, it adds nothing. As far as I'm concerned, it adds nothing to the palette. It should have been made more of a chocolatey brown, probably, because I think that would have brought more value to the palette itself and to the users of the palette. Oh, let's talk about Norns from Uden's Eye. This was the first Uden's Eye palette I bought. Sadly, I think it might be time for me to pass it on, because it has been a while since I used this palette. In fact, the last time I used it was doing a palette bingo with a friend, and I was making myself do the palette bingo because I wanted to use the palette. This palette does not excite me anymore. It did in the beginning, but since I got it, my eyeshadow tastes, preferences, skills, everything has advanced and become a little bit more honed. And so now I have a better idea of what I like to wear, the shades and color ranges that I like. And unfortunately, this palette doesn't really fit the bill in most of the tones. I do very much like some of these tones. I think this is beautiful. This is beautiful. These two colors right here are beautiful. And the entire bottom row is amazing. There is some multi-chromes in here. It's super, super pretty. I think the bottom row is what keeps me from passing it on. But to be honest, I don't often reach into it. So what's the point of that, right? I think it's time to pass it along. Anyway, within this palette, there are actually a couple of shades that I do not use anymore. And it's because of the formula. I don't use this shade here, Passion. I don't use Realism, and I don't often use Obsessed. Although this one does get more use than the other two. But basically, Passion and Realism get no use because they're this weird formula. They're not matte, but they're not shimmer. They're kind of somewhere in the middle, like a creamy sort of matte. And I find them really difficult to use. Like, which brush do I use? Probably a more stiff synthetic brush would pick up the color. But then the color doesn't distribute very nicely. It doesn't blend out very well. It doesn't build exceptionally well. I just find that particular formula, which I have seen in some of the older Uden's Eye palettes, but none of the newer ones, I find it difficult to work with. And I don't think that the palette is expired. It is a couple years old at this point. Probably 2, as far as when I bought it. I don't know. But I don't think it's expired because I had problems with those shades for the same reason the first time I used them when I first got the palette. And I think that red shade, Passion, I think I used that like the first time I got the palette because that one was exciting to me. And I was pretty bummed, like, well, maybe my technique isn't there and I just can't make it work. But no, because now I'm more advanced and I still have trouble making it work. I struggle with those two shades. Aside from those, this shade right here, Dazed, is really an unexciting color. However, I can use it to buff out an edge or something. And Pragmatism here sometimes gets used. I don't know. The whole palette is kind of neglected and it's sad, and I'm kind of thinking I should sell it to somebody who will actually get use out of it, because as much as I like it, and I love the packaging and I have memories of this palette because it's my first Uden's Eye palette, I guess it's just being wasted. Might be time to pass it on. I do want to talk about the Kaale X Glamlight palette. This is a pretty good one. I really enjoy the bottom 3 rows because there's just so much color variety, although it's a little purple heavy. Within this palette, it's easy for me to say the top 2 rows get almost no use. Sometimes I'll dip into these more peachy orangey tones. Sometimes I would grab this purple, although there are other purples that I might like better. The whole top row I never use. This shade right here, What's Poppin', I think I may have swatched it, and that's literally the only time I've touched it, as far as I can recall. I have recently been thinking I should get some more neutral palettes, including a brown palette, and I'm thinking of getting Wild Child from ColourPop because it's got these lovely chocolatey browns. It's got a row, the top row I believe is warm toned, the bottom row is cool toned, and then there's some in between. You've got shimmers and mattes in both light and dark, so it's a good palette even though it's only 9 shades. However, that one might be put on hold just because I do have some browns here that I'd sort of forgotten about. Now, unfortunately, these are all mid to light tone. There's nothing really dark except this one, and this one's more purple. But between this and 1 or 2 other palettes, I have a couple of browns that maybe I should play with before I go spend money on a whole brown palette. I don't know. I can easily say the top 2 rows in this palette pretty much don't get touched. They're okay, but I wish the whole palette were colorful. Because even within these 2 rows, there's not a lot of variety. I mean, these first 3 shades, you could have done with one of them. They're all basically the same. They're not the same, but they're really close. Take out some of the purples, take out some of the neutrals, and either make the palette smaller or keep it the same size and bring in additional colors. But overall, those top 2 rows get almost no use. And finally, let's talk about Passion Paris from BH Cosmetics. There are a couple of palettes in my collection that I'm not talking about because when I looked in them, I was like, no, I actually do use all these shades at some point, you know. But within Passion in Paris, I can easily look and see which shades have been dipped into and which have been left alone. The shade up here called City of Light is a mid-tone silvery matte with like a little hint of a greeny blue kind of color, but I never use it. I think it's a little bit too dark toned to be a silver that I want to bring in when I'm doing that kind of a look. I never use it. Also, I think Moulin Rouge doesn't get very much use because it's so close in tone to the red matte next to it and this red matte over here, but particularly Pompidou. Pompidou I'll use, but then Moulin Rouge, I might grab a reddish or pinkish or purple shimmer from somewhere else that brings in a bit more of a metallic shine, which Moulin Rouge doesn't offer me. I mean, it's okay. It's just more of a deep ruby red, and I find that it doesn't get that much use. So yeah, within this palette, Moulin Rouge and City of Light are pretty well ignored. I have not used Versailles very much, but looking at it, because of the whole, you know, dark purple, dark blue sort of thing. However, looking at it, it's got a lot of flecks of different shades. It's not a multi-chrome, but it's sort of, it's got a purple base. And when you look at it in the pan, you see some purple and silver and blue and pinky kind of reflex. And I think it's really interesting. So maybe I'll try to incorporate this in the look. It's almost got a gray or a black base as well. I don't know, it's an interesting shade. It's more interesting than Moulin Rouge, you know? It's just a little more exciting, and I'm certainly more inclined to use more exciting shades rather than more traditional shades. And there you have it. That is part 2 of shades which get almost no use within my collection. Again, thank you very much to Auntie D. Remy for suggesting this video idea. It was a lot of fun. I do enjoy these videos because it's fun to go through my collection and pull out things that fit in a certain theme. I hope that you liked the video. Thank you for hanging out with me. If you want to see more, I hope that you'll consider liking and subscribing because several videos a week. And until I see you in my next one, I hope you have a great day. Bye.